First, the question of today's date. Wakamik kahib noch chupam rihunab hulahuch kirch. Today is for know-how in the year 11 Deer, which began on February 22nd. There are about 60 communities in Guatemala that still keep a couple of parts of the Maya calendar, and could tell you, if you were sitting on a bus next to one of them, they might tell you, press this point on you, whether you really wanted to know anything about the Maya calendar or not, just to show you that they're in a different time, a timekeeping system that goes back to at least 600 BC and probably earlier than that. So today is, among other things, Kahib Noch. And that's a date on the divinatory calendar. As you see there, the math of it is 13 numbers rotating against 20-day names to produce 260 combinations. They often call it the calendar of the earth. That's an approximation of human gestation. 13 is the number of major joints in the body, and the number of days the moon has appeared has been visible when it's full. Western astronomy loses sight of that, but in the Islamic world, they still count 13 as the number of the moon, not 15 and a half or whatever it is by Western reckoning, at the age of the full moon. And then 20 is all of this. They don't cut out the toes. So it's a very human calendar, that one. And then it's meshed together with the 365. And there I do have to look. You can't really see much of what's going on there, but those are the kinds of things people say at a shrine. This happens to be the day 8 monkey, and this was in 2005. It happened to fall in February. They're big ceremonial events governed by this calendar. Then are not predictable by the season. They migrate through the seasons. About 15,000 people gather in a town called Momostenango, or Chuatzak in Maya. All those Nango names you see in Guatemala were actually brought by the Spanish, who asked their Nahuatl-speaking allies from Central America, what do they call this place? And bilingual people would ask some Mayan, Chuatzak, and then they would translate that into Nahuatl, and so you get these polysyllabic names. So even the Indian names you see on a Guatemalan map are actually colonialist names. The Aztec Empire imposing itself in the mouths of Spaniards. Now, there's a lot of things to be learned from ethnography and linguistics, even though the Mayan writing system is being used now, and even by a Mayan-owned press in Guatemala City, but it last stopped being used by the Mayans probably around 1650 or so, after 100 years of book-burning efforts and missionary efforts. One of the things the Spaniards did was teach alphabetic writing. They were not interested in abolishing the languages, but only that they should be written in the alphabet. And they taught boys how to write, whereas Mayan writers always included women. Nice westernization going on there. It still goes on all over the developing world in various ways. The people who bring digital technology to the third world are mostly guys, and they transmit it to guys. It goes on and on and on. But back here it took the form of priests teaching boys how to write. So this man is divining, and he's doing a kind of reading, a very special kind of reading here, where he's taken a random handful of those seeds, he's laying them out in groups of 4 to see how they come out. He'll count days on the calendar so he can read the seeds because he knows how to recite the calendar, starting with today's date or whatever date somebody asked a question about, like next 7 dog, should I go and do such and such a thing? So he'll start from that day. And each of those days has a divinatory meaning, is packed with meaning. So in a sense, each one of those little groups of seeds you see him laying out has a complex text behind it. a lot of that stuff was written in the Mayan books, but now it's all transmitted orally. And one of the most interesting things about that is the way the day names are interpreted. Many of them are interpreted by means of what Barbara Tedlock, my wife, who's also an anthropologist, studied this, oral rebus. So tsi, you don't interpret the day name tsi as having to do with something, having just what is the personality of a dog, although you can go down that road. Instead, you do a word play. You go hula hu tsi. This happens to be, I wrote here, it happens to be the number 11, but that doesn't change the meaning of the tsi. Hula hu tsi, tsi ala tsir. You see highlighted in red there the different sound plays. These are not funny sound plays. They're scary, falling through from one level of language to another, like a kind of there's a B.P. Nicola, Canadian poet, represented this kind of thing as people falling through a trapdoor into another room in a kind of picture a page of cartoon where the characters are dropping through to the next row of pictures. So bat's unique. So monkey becomes something to do with thread and so on. You see the word for tooth becomes something to do with roads and so forth. So we now know that one of the things operating in the Mayan writing system is written rebus. So you see there, I'm not going to try to use the touchpad. I think I'll just let you use your eyes. You see the little picture of a torch there, and you can read that as tach, the word for torch. So it's a logograph, a word sign. But it can also be used as a syllabic sign, so you just say ta. And then that's the way that character in the upper left is written. And it all adds up as aktach, meaning he or she dances. One of the neat things about Native American languages, 100% of them, is that there are no gendered pronouns. You don't have to say he or she or they in this post, everything is he age. It was never a problem in these languages. In most of the languages of the world, for that matter. That's another part of the Western baggage, is those gendered pronouns. And then the other one you see, it's a tail of a jaguar, if you didn't sort of start to figure that out. And you could read it as nech, depending on the context, or it becomes the syllable ne in yune, his, her, child. Another thing you learn by studying, you can pick this up in the colonial dictionaries too, but from modern speakers. In all Mayan languages, the word for writing, the verb stem is tsib, or something very close to that. But it covers writing as we think of it, and it covers graphic art in general. Everything you see on that bit of textile, which is a man's headscarf woven by his wife, and it got faded and it was washed, and so it was sold to, as a nice Guatemalan textile you could take home with you, but it still has his name on it, Manuel Tsept Katinak. Everything on there is writing except for the stripes. Parallel lines like that, even with that color variation, are not considered tsib. Also, there's some reason to think that probably that term there's a kind of limit to how much it applies to three-dimensional design. It may apply to carved inscriptions in low relief. We can't really know that for sure. For the past, but it seems like one of the ingredients is flat surface. So designs created by a weaver, as in this case are tsib. And what happens when a tourist buys one of these things is that the alphabetic writing there looks wrong, so they tear it out. Whereas to the Mayans, it's just another kind of writing. Now, part of that is a kind of pictorial art, highly geometricized, as you can see. What interests Mayans about that is the paradigmatic change the change from same to different as you go across those two large figures. This weaver did a little something different with the three monkeys on the bottom row, leaving the heads off of a couple of them just to produce variation. Those signs in the middle, here I will wander over. These are unique to her. Anyone seeing this in this village, town, would know who wove this. And reading your husband's name, they would know who once wore it around his head. The little birds, you notice there, she just used mirror reversal to vary them, plus the color variations. Mayans are really interested in this, what linguists would call a paradigm, where some things are held different while a suffix changes, or you keep the suffixes the same and you put a different stem in the middle of them, and so on. And they do this auditorily too. So when they're listening to bird calls, most birds and animals they hear is just doing repeated sounds over and over again. And as this man is saying, that doesn't mean anything. So this Steller's jay, which is pretty familiar all over the western US, we don't have them here. The jays, says André Schiloch, when they go on the road, they suddenly whistle, shao, shh. Then there is evil in the road, since the jays are whistling. And when they just sing, shao, 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 it doesn't mean anything. But when it's shao, shh, then there is a problem in the road. So just the experience of seeing something paradigmatic, even in nature, then gives the perceiver pause. Perhaps there's a meaning there, because it's one step closer to being like human language. There's another interesting thing, thinking about reading in this ethnographic context. So on the left there, from Copan in Honduras, you have a stela. There's a high relief figure on the front of it and writing on the side, as you can see. I always ask students, showing a whole bunch of things from all over the world like this, how can you tell the writing from the stuff, or what we think is the writing, from the rest of the stuff? And one of the dead giveaways all over the place, past, present, future, is that grid. In any case, so there's, and then that excavation in front used to be an altar, and they dug up all the offerings. The archaeologists did, but the thing is, so here's an inscription, and people would have stood there making offerings and saying things. Mayans are still standing, in this case it's a bunch of pottery that was used as incense burners at home being piled up. This is that 8 monkey place again, and this man is piling up words there, and the modern people who go to these places and pray to the sky, to the earth, and to all of their ancestors, see themselves as making a deposition. They say everything that has ever been said at these shrines is inscribed there, even though you can't see it. They've modernized that a bit. They see the gods as having filing cabinets, and they'll soon see them as having digital technology, I'm sure. Another thing you learn from the ethnography, they have this notion that to really push eloquence the right distance, you need another speaker. You need to hire somebody to, in this case, to help you pray more effectively, somebody who's professional. Sometimes the person you hire even prays simultaneously with you. It doesn't have to be this text followed by this text. And these professional singers always carry books with them. Sometimes they don't bother to look at them much because they're very, very good at oral composition. So in a way, the books are just a badge of their literacy. They're very good at producing, Mayans are very nostalgic for, among other things, the Latin Mass and Gregorian chant. And these prayer makers, among other things, can produce that if that's what you want, in addition to the most eloquent possible Mayan prayers at these shrines. Now, back to the past. There's some evidence for a splitting up of functions, even in the archaeological evidence. These are drawn from a couple of carved slabs that were on both sides of a stairway leading to a throne. And the man on the left has become known as the orator, and on the right, the scribe. And maybe you can already begin to see the reason for that interpretation. Maybe, can I get a cursor? Yeah, here's the cursor. Whoops, I was afraid that would happen. I can't get a light enough touch. So, you see the line leading up to the text. The Mayans do, not a whole lot, but in both sculpture and in the painting, they do, it's not exactly a balloon, but it's the same idea as in a cartoon. That's what he's saying there. And you notice he's making his voice carry like this. And the man on the right is holding a pen. But he also seems to be speaking. We don't need to see this as a snapshot. They're not necessarily doing this at whatever they're doing at the same time. So he's been identified as the scribe. But the man on the left, well, you can't see it very well. There's certain items of clothing that identify him as a literate person. So it's not as if there was somebody who was just the mouthpiece of the writer. Both of those men would have been literate, but one of them more skilled at oratory. The guy on the right, although he has a pen, also has his mouth open. But they would have perhaps said somewhat different things. They're in penitential outfits for some reason or other, with holes poked in their banners and so on. And here's another slightly different splitting up. Let's see if I can touch lightly enough this time. These glyphs here identify him as Chuhun, a keeper of books or papers, although he doesn't have one with him. And this man is identified right here as a Chilam, a spokesman. Whoop. And but they both have their mouths open, and both of them are identified as literate by, I have to be very careful here. Whoop. All right. You see in the top of he's got tucked in his headdress a bundle of what look like sticks. Those are quill blanks. And over here, he has them too. So they are both literate. They're badging their role as literate people by carrying around, tucked up here, the blanks they stripped all the barbs off the quills. You almost never see the feathers. So if you were a writer then, oh, okay, good. Is that really going to, can you see that? Yeah, okay. So here's the bunch of quill blanks ready to be sharpened. When Chris was speaking, I wanted to remind everybody that that's the reason for the word pen knife. Pen knives were for sharpening pens. Okay, so that's the story on these guys. So they're both literate. They both spoke. I'm guessing that the guy in front here, there's a royal throne to the right. The guy in the front is making what the librarian on the left, making it more understandable, interpreting it. Whereas the guy behind there might have spoken straight out of his book knowledge, like a professor. And here, there's another kind of interesting pairing of ideas here. The Popol Vuh, an alphabetic 16th century book written in Keychain Maya, talk about the gods of writing as writing, of which there are two. Writing, carving is all they work at every day. This pairing of writing and carving. So the man sitting on the dais there is either painting or maybe that's a carving tool. It's hard to say. And usually they're shown working on a mask. And then this fellow has a quill rather than they also used reed pens, but you can tell this was a quill because of the curve. And the ink pots were laterally halved conch shells. That's resting. And this is a pile of paper with a jaguar skin cover, or maybe even a finished screen-folded book. Now, I'm just going to raise some questions about this, but there's something very interesting going on here that's a clue to how they thought about writing. There's one of these ink pots that still has the red stains in it. This one does. This is one of the monkey gods of writing. This is one Hung Bats, one howler monkey. He's leaning over a book. Here's another one underneath. And this is comical. He is pouring the ink onto the page from his ink pot. You see? It's kind of a joke. You could also say that he's writing very loudly. And howler monkeys produce more decibels than any other animal in the world. So again and again, you get clues to a Mayan fascination with the relationship between writing and speech and images like that. Here, this fellow is, there we go. Apparently that's a brush pen. It's very straight, so it's a reed with some, we don't know whether they used hairs or what they stuffed in the business end of the reed. A pile of paper. Here's his ink pot. And his partner, this is a rollout of a painting on a vase. On the other side of the vase, is not carving at the moment, but he's holding one of these masks and interestingly gesturing instead of working on the mask. I don't know how to interpret that. Both of them are up against a nice stuffed cushions with a little bit of jaguar skin there you're seeing. Here is a woman who's, there's her quill blanks. She's got hieroglyphs down here, and she's just contemplating the mask in this case. And then here's a monkey god again, and this is the most fascinating one of all. So here's the open book with the page propped back. The book's probably opened this way, but the artist, I mean, how do you represent in profile a person who has a book opened this way? And they usually turn it, some aspect of the book toward the viewer. But so there's a mask resting on the page as if writing wanted to be three-dimensional, or there's something, or writing is a mask for real speech, or something's going on there. Then we have this wonderful pot with a different god of writing, Powhatan. There's 4 of him, one for each direction. Or maybe he's just 4 aspects of the same god. It doesn't matter that much. When we look at the one on the other side, you'll see one of the differences is this one has a beard under his chin and the other one doesn't. A lot of writers wear these rasta dus. People with a priestly status didn't cut their hair. And they stuck it all in a net. And then here's a brush pen. So then imagine, it's not too different from the way we can imagine you could just reach up here to get your pen instead of behind your ear. Or, I don't know if anyone still puts these things behind their ears, but and he's teaching numbers to this student. And next we have a rollout. And both sides of this vase are about student mistakes. And you see the teacher doesn't look very pleasant there, and this fellow is kind of, there's also a clue here that perhaps the people who, instead of practicing agriculture or something a little more active, well, this guy looks like a jock, but most of the scribes in these paintings look rather sedentary, like the guy in front of the teacher there. who's looking down and trying to understand his error. And apparently he was asked to write numbers in order. And that thing is a filler. That's 1, 1, and 5. So 7, 8. So he's written 7, 8, 9, 12, 13, 11. So not only did he get out of order, but he left 10 out altogether. What's happening on the other side, here's, by the way, in both cases, I forgot to point it out there. See, this is what he's saying, this whole thing actually, ending. See the connection there? He's saying all of this to the pupil. And in this case, the pupil was probably asked to say Kib Yash, Kib Khan, the two that are green, the two that are yellow. But he turned, that's the normal mention of those two colors. He turned the colors around, and instead of writing 2, he put 2 fillers plus the number 1. This part hasn't been deciphered, but this is ta-tab, which means badly written. Now the neatest thing about this, so it's a transposition. This guy clearly has figured it out. Look at that. He's, oh, I see. He turned them around. But this guy hasn't a clue, at least not yet, the one in front. Now begins a quick tour through how the writing system works. One of the universal things about well-developed writing systems is there's a system of numeration that goes along with them. The Mayans had place numeration. So you have, here's 1 through 19 plus 0. 0 is sometimes written this way. That just means nothing. Whereas this thing is more iconic. It's an image of an empty seashell for 0. There you see you can see how the bars and dots work. And then on the lower left there, the way what so-called long count dates were counted from a hypothetical beginning date of the calendar in 4,100 and something BC. They put their 0 date. Some of you may know, actually, the Christian calendar, well, it doesn't have a 0 date. There's 1 BC followed by 1 AD. They didn't understand mathematics at all. But even that one was a hypothetical backwards casting, although not by a huge number of years. Whereas the Mayans projected their astronomy backwards to a hypothetical starting date. That's way before they actually began writing. So, but they did they cheated on the vigesimal rather than decimal system in one place. To make this more like a count of years, they have in this third place 360 instead of 400. And then the rest of the numbers fall out. And it's for somewhat different reasons that the Babylonians left us with this troublesome number, the number of degrees in the circle and so on. It wasn't just because of the approximation of the year, it was also their fascination with the number 30 and multiples thereof that were at play in that. And then alternatively, you can write numbers with the portraits of the patrons. So I've just given you 8, 9, and 10 there. When you're doing a fancy inscription, you can use those heads instead of the bars and dots. And then I've been trying to speculate on how the system was taught. And one thing is for certain, the closest thing to an alphabet would have been teaching the logographs for the 20 day names of the divinatory calendar. And there you see 2 different versions of those. And there are other things they could have grouped. Since there's a ritual circuit of directions that goes north, west, south, east, center, and each one has a color. They could have easily grouped these color glyphs. Sak is white, Ik is black, Kan is yellow, Chak is red, and Yash is green or blue. There's a wonderful iconicity, and when I show this kind of thing, I always like to point out something people miss in a less complicated version of C.S. Peirce on semiotics, which is there are icons that are pictorial, but there are other icons that are diagrammatic, and the Mayans used both. So that first thing, chok means to scatter something. That's pretty obvious. Kin is diagrammatic because the flower represents the sun, but those 5 dots represent the 4 directions and the center, which is a diagram, not a picture of the sun. The third one means dream or a person's spirit familiar. So you see a face that's half turning into a jaguar's face. And then the last one is chen, is the word for cave. And there you see an eye on the boundary between light and dark, looking to the left. The reading direction is left to right. So it's not us looking into the cave, but it's something in the cave looking out at us. Then there's, in the details of the iconicity, there's sometimes really fine details, and I put this in for Chris and Chuck because they keep macaws. And they taught me something about macaws too, which is that they can blush, which explains one of the episodes in the Popol Vuh. This one isn't blushing. On the left is the syllabic sign for plain, unadorned ah, which has to do with terminology for beaks and so on. On the right is a logogram for mo, which means macaw. And notice how the different scribes, writers, made use of different sorts of details. But in 5 of those, but not in the last one, they all picked up on this scallop in the beak. The German diffusionists of the 19th century read this thing on the left as an elephant's trunk and immediately thought the Mayans had come from Southeast Asia. Then here's examples of syllabic signs. The small ones are affixes. They have the same meaning. So here plain vowel or weak vowel plus weak consonant things on top. And I just picked the ones for la, le, li, lo, lu on the bottom. We don't yet know how all the syllables are filled out. And then in all the chauvinistic stuff about the alphabet and its supposed clarity and that anyone can learn it, they forget that in mixed writing systems you're always given more information than you need, not only the information you need. So again and again, the scribes could not resist putting phonetic supplements on logograms. The Balaam, the jaguar there, is pretty obvious, but the scribe chose in syllabic systems, if you get a word ending in a consonant, you use a syllable there, and it's understood not to pronounce the ah. So he's telling the reader, if you didn't see that this was a jaguar, think of a word that ends in And on the left, everything is, the first and last syllables are both put there, even though this thing alone is enough to read it as unique. More information than you need. Here is a spider monkey. The word is mush. And look how they picked up, this one picks up on that bare spot, and perhaps there too. This one picks up on the lip line, although it's inverted here. This one picks up on that buzz cut effect. And here's the dark fur. But 3 of them have a phonetic supplement. All 3 of those things read ma. Think of a word beginning in ma, in case you don't see that this is a monkey. And then in all mixed writing systems, there's no national academy deciding how you should spell things. So here's a logograph for Pakal on the left, and there's Pakal syllabified on the right. And one of the cleverest things is if you've got to get a repeated sound, it's not necessarily the entire syllable that's repeated. The scribe can put 2 dots. So you notice a tsu, nu, nu, leave off the last vowel. You get sunun, the word for hummingbird. And here is the word for cacao. So ka, ka, wa, but cacao, leave off the last vowel. See, the 2 dots are right here. And then conflation, po plus mo equals pum, the word for incense. And then the writing shades off into, linguists would stop here because now we're getting into poetics. Mayan verse is full of parallelism, as is the Hebrew Testament, but not the Greek Testament. And here we have a combination of, by conflation of fire and smoke. Mayan said fire and smoke instead of smoke and fire. They didn't see any need for a conjunction there. You would just say fire, smoke. You don't have to say fire and smoke. This is a little more elaborate. And this is a case where I don't know whether Powhatan would have wanted it read utok upakal or utok pakal. In Chinese, too, there are combinations of complementary terms welded together into a single word. There are a lot of Mayan words like that. Closest thing to a word for world just means sky, earth. It's pronounced as one word. Then this is getting a little more complicated. Closest thing to what we could call a signature here, although it's not as though the rest of the glyphs on this vase would have been drawn in a different style. But here the painter is identifying herself. And you can see here, since I've got this, I can show you. One of the things we don't know, how would they have, we can't bring them back from the dead and figure out how their eyes travel through this. The person who was talking about yesterday about how the eye travels through alphabetic writing and kind of stops and starts, didn't talk about the vertical dimension. But here you would think, or at least when we read this, we have to go like this. In, ishik, ish tsib chan, ish ahau balam, ach sibal. So the eye, as I assume it does in Chinese characters, has to kind of dwell or, kind of loop through instead of going straight ahead to the next character. Notice the iconicity here, the scribal hand on utsib, utsiba. Here's another. This is a short passage from a Mayan book, the Dresden Codex, a pair of side-by-side almanacs, just to show you the reading. Usually it's in 2 columns, so you go from here to here, 1, 2, 1, 2, and this is a separate text. So pairs of columns, left to right, top to bottom. And then there's this relationship between text and picture all through the... So you notice the owl in the picture and the owl up here have the same eye. The horns aren't drawn in the same way. Here's, actually she's got a little hair here, which is the syllable for moon. It's also the word for moon. And so on. But it's not only an iconic relationship between the text and the picture here, but a diagrammatic one as well, because in both, the owl is above the moon. And here's a stretch of Dresden has about 76 pages, but here's a few of them. Those are all moon almanacs. Once a year, they spread the books out on beds of rushes and sprinkled them with verdigris, which, among other things, would keep insects away. Maya land is not Egypt, so the paper didn't preserve very well. There's 4 flattened pages. Notice the registers. And okay, look at that for a moment. The next slide is going to show you how those pages are organized. The Mayan reader is not looking to see what is on what page, but what is in what register. So that's how that splits up. There are 7 chapters there. That top one goes on for another 2.5 pages before it's done with. But the bottom 6 actually are contained just as you see them there, each one beginning with a set of dates. And then here is one of my favorite inscriptions. This one starts right there. When you turn this part of the vase, this hasn't been deciphered. When you turn this toward you, then the first fully visible glyph is the first glyph in the text. They wrote these rim and bottom texts continuously, and you have to be a good reader to figure out where to start, except if you followed this clue here. So, Utsib Yalwai Le Itza Ach Masham, the writing, the speaking of the dream of a skilled observer, a person from Masham, which is marked on the map as Naranjo, the ruin known as Naranjo. And then this scribe, that's all a signature or a self-identification, goes on to say who this person's mother is, first of all, as it continues around. There you see that. Nothing in the inscription identifies the gender of the scribe, because Yah means a person born of a person born, so therefore of a woman, of either sex. We don't have a term like that in English. Child, there's really no term that says child of either sex of a parent of a particular gender. And here's the description of this person's father. And actually, this particular writer, artist, there's no personal name here, just the names of the royal parents. That's another difference with the Middle East and with Greece. In Greece, the upper classes, the royalty, were not in Athens taught to write. That would dirty your hands. It was more of a, throughout the Middle East, more of a craft specialty. Now, as Chris pointed out, sometimes scribes were certainly honored, but they still, did things with their hands, other than throw spears at their enemies or something. And then one of my favorite things, Mayan concrete poetry. This artist, well, I have to show you. This artist left out, there. That's the sign for mirror. Instead of, there's just a trace of it here. Notice it's also flipped around in mirror image. So instead of making it clear that this is the god with the mirror in his forehead, this scribe wrote the glyph in mirror image, whereas the bat glyph there runs around the pot in the right order. But also that's the sign for the syllable tsi, is an alternative reading of it. So you have to decide whether you wanted to read it as a logograph or as a syllable. So as a logograph, it comes out like this. Immediately we see what the lack of iconicity does to the alphabet. I mean, these, if we didn't have the picture there, these could be baseball bats or whatever kind of bat you like. And then, but if we choose to read it as tseet, tseet, and you would go tseet, 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 tseet. That's the squeaky sounds emitted by a lot of animals, including bats. So here's a an alternative translation. And here's another one. Those are two opposite sides of the same pot. This huge date marks the end of a 7,200-day period that ended March 31st, 773. But the artist, this is a kind of a schematic picture of a deity. The artist turned this into a window and puts a human lord into that spot. And on the other side, this text, I'll tell you what it means in a minute, but put the whole text in the form of the identifying sign in these glyphs here, which gives us a pretty good idea that we're talking about somebody from a site known as San Jose Motul, whose royalty identified themselves with that. There's a rollout version of the same pot with the color restored and a translation. It was a chocolate drinking vessel. These were given to young heirs to thrones when they were very small children, and a cacao grove was planted for them, and then they could celebrate the first fruits by drinking from a cup like this. Cacao only takes 3 to 5 years to bear fruit, so these were still pretty small kids at the point where they lifted up the cup and drank this chocolate. And then finally, we have here monumental inscriptions. This is a 1880s wonderful photograph of one of these stelas. And notice the double size of the characters on top here, then going back to the double column format. And this is a scribe carver kind of getting out of control and going over the edge of illegibility. On the right is all that means if you want to read it as a text. It's a part of a date, 15 stones, those are 360-day periods. 0 score days, 0 single days on the day 7 how. But what you have here in the top one is the god of 15 wrestling with the god of a rather horrible creature, the patron of that time period. Here's the god of 0 who has this hand on his jaw, wrestling with the god of scores of days, and here wrestling with the god of single days. And then they put the day name how nicely apart, but the god of 7 is still all tangled up with himself. And the only reason anybody could even read that is that it occurs in an inscription where you would expect that kind of dating to occur. This stela, those are the inscriptions on the two sides of it, has a much more legible inscription. And I'm not going to run through the whole translation, but just to show you why I really love this stuff. So here's the Mayan inscription on the left, and there on the right is an English translation cast as in the form of a Greek inscription, a gridded inscription. I couldn't figure out how to put it in Greek letters, but and I had to mess with Courier to get that equal spacing. But anyway, that's why the alphabet cries out for pictures or for ornament. And then finally, one of the most famous pieces of carving, a lintel from Lady Sharkfin's palace at Yaxchilan. The Mayan equivalent of the Elgin marbles in more ways than one, since the thing not too mysteriously landed in the British Museum. And it's a lintel, and you actually would enter the building walking under it this way and looking up at it. It would be across like the lengthwise, and you'd be looking up at it. And the Egyptians did the same thing. Sometimes in doorways, Mayans would run the inscription toward the interior of the building. which is why they put all the captioning in that one in mirror image to draw you inside in that direction. That's a star map of what was happening in the event that this inscription talks about. And last slide, there's the lintel turned so we can go under it. And the front edge has this inscription of a later event, the occasion on which Lady Sharkfin dedicated her palace. And I'll just read that because it gives you a sense of the cadence of Mayan poetry. After 0 and 70 days, 2 single stones and 2 stones had passed since she summoned the spirit of the scepter on the long river at Drum Sky. It was on 3 Seba 14 well that she consecrated her sculpted palace. Lady who offers gems, Lady Jaguar Shark, Lady Sharkfin, Lady of the Red Tree, in the plaza on the long river at Drum Sky, on the lands in the hollows of the keeper of the kingdom, true magician Jaguar, Lord who offers gems for Drum Sky. That's it.